Hello and welcome to the lecture presentation for week 12 of this course, and this week we're looking at technology and globalization, and as usual we have two papers to take a look at this week. We're going to be looking at Aldrich et al. Technology Transfers in a Global Economy, which looks at global economic developments as we'll see in the global context. And Francisco, The Internet is Magic, Transnational Families and Technology, looks at the situation of families who have members who live overseas and the relations between them and how they're sustained and really transformed by technology. And as we'll see, the role of visual technologies in particular has brought about quite a significant change in how families are able to keep connected. Especially families that may not be able to return home, either because they're undocumented or whatever the situation is in their original home, which prevents them from returning home if they're refugees or whatever the situation is. So this Francisco's article will take a look at that context. So let's talk first about Aldrich et al. And the relation between technology and globalization in the current phase of globalization. Of course, globalization not a new thing, but the current phase has some important differences with previous phases and previous levels of globalization. So let's talk a little bit about that before looking at what Aldrich wants to say about this context and this connection. So we might define economic globalization as the integration of national economies into the international economy through trade, direct foreign investment, and short-term capital flows, international flows of workers and humanity generally, and the flow of technology. So a lot of components in terms of the way that national economies are integrated and states are integrated into this sort of this system of global trade, and especially through laws which sort of mandate that states have to honor foreign investment and have to. There have been a lot of attempts to force states to compensate investors who may be damaged by decisions that are made by states. So there's been a sort of shift of power that's gone along with this economic globalization, and it's been a shift of power away from national states and towards international, especially international corporations that have a seat or have a location in different parts of the world, in different countries, based on how their sort of mechanisms and how their supply chain is structured. So some examples, and really all of these are examples of the fact that the current phase of globalization involves multinational corporations that structure their supply chains across different countries to take advantage of low wage labor in some countries, and to take advantage of high skilled labor that can do other things like marketing and product development in typical high income countries. So there's been a kind of structuring of global corporations across the world in terms of they're seated in developed countries and developing countries, and make use of the resources of those countries, whether they're cheap labor or high skilled labor doing sort of other tasks like marketing and development. So that the immediate consequences you see from that are things like these: that Nike manufactures shoes in Indonesia and imports them to be sold in the US. When you call the Dell Help Center, you speak to somebody in India, and a lot of these and those sort of call center jobs were among the first of some so-called white collar jobs to be offshored and to be globalized. The first wave of globalization focused in the 1980s and 90s focused primarily on manual labor jobs, and so typically unskilled labor or labor that involves manual labor that can easily be easily be transferred to non-skilled or low-skilled workers in other parts of the world. But recently the phenomenon has started to affect more white-collar workers. Of course, Hollywood movies are pirated and sold much cheaper in China. And of course, any given car will have parts from different parts of the world, again reflecting the way that the supply chains of multinational corporations now have locations and functions in many different countries in the world to take advantage of different resources. So key relation here to have a look at between globalization and imbalances, and we can talk about imbalances between countries that are created, so trade imbalances, current account surpluses and deficits. In other words, some countries will trade more than they or sell more than they buy on the international market, leading to either surpluses or deficits. Trade deficits, which can be structural and long-lasting. Unbalanced flows of foreign direct investment between countries. So wealthy Western countries are providers of foreign direct investment, and that usually ends up in countries like, the BRICS have been, the Brazil, Russia, China, and India have been beneficiaries of foreign direct investment, and a lot of poorer countries as well. Imbalances in access to global markets, ideas, health and education. So the trade, as it's driven by corporations, creates many global imbalances in access to markets, in health and education, and so on. And imbalances within countries, obviously rising income and wealth inequalities within countries, which is compensated to an extent by the kind of global narrowing of inequality in total, because of the way that middle classes in China and Brazil and Russia are kind of catching up with Western countries. China especially has contributed through really growing its middle class to bringing about a kind of compression of income inequality across the world. But of course, that's matched by the fact that there's rising inequality within countries, and particularly in wealthy countries or Western countries like the United States and Europe. Large differences in structural unemployment rates between countries, and imbalances between rural and urban areas in different regions. And this is some of the things we'll see in the argument that there's an emphasis on universities as sort of drivers of global competition and so on. But of course, universities tend to be situated in urban regions or in areas where they can access a lot of other things, where they're in relation with sort of local industry, technology startups, that sort of thing. So these universities are obviously not, if they're going to be keyed into the global economy, they're less likely to be situated in rural areas. And of course, that only intensifies the imbalance between rural and urban areas that already exists. So the shift of focus of technology transfer after the 1990s in the new global era is something that Ardrech and colleagues focus on here in this article. And in particular, we see a shift from north-south technology transfer to the exploitation of competitive advantage within global competition. So in the post-war era, the technology transfer tended to be from the global north to the global south, and it drove industrialization of countries who were slow to industrialize, or slower than Western countries to industrialize. So it promoted growth in southern economic industrial growth, in particular in southern nations. So now we see a different kind of transfer, where it's in order to secure competitive advantage within global competition, which effectively means finding resources. Investment finds resources in particular countries that can be leveraged to create global advantage. So again, that will mean cheaper wages in a particular country, or the availability of a large number of workers trained in a particular task or a particular skill. and so that those advantages can be exploited by investment, which is sort of driven towards those areas, and of course other areas that have sort of high tech capabilities, they will also suck in investment. So it's not north south anymore. It's in order to secure competitive advantage. So along with that, we see a shift in production processes in the global era, and we see that production processes are becoming increasingly fragmented, and corporations are outsourcing key stages of production to other countries with cheaper labor costs. So processes are not, a production process is not, the sort of classic model of manufacturing a car on an assembly line where everything's done in-house and each stage is done until the sort of final product is ready to go. Here it's the current contemporary production process, the global process, is very fragmented, with different parts of the process farmed out often to subsidiary corporations. For example, Apple does a lot of its industrial work in China, sourcing out the actual production and manufacture of its phones and so on, and the marketing work and the branding and all of the other kind of work is done in other places. There are call centers in different parts of the world that are used, and of course the Apple has a presence in California with high-tech workers. But this is a fragmented process where different parts of the world, different parts of the global economy are contributing different pieces to the manufacture of a specific product. Now, Aldrich and his colleagues talk about the importance of entrepreneurship in this connection, and talk about the importance of policies to foster entrepreneurship in order to create what they call an entrepreneurial society. And the central role of the university in technology transfer and promoting knowledge-based startup firms is one thing that they strongly emphasize, and they look at the university as taking on a new task here of promoting economic development. Now, one of the problems with this idea of an entrepreneurial society, it kind of sounds nice and it sounds very contemporary, and it sounds like it sounds like a good idea. But one of the things about the US economy is that it's become far less entrepreneurial over time. And if we look at this graph of the change in firm entry, in other words, how many new firms are entering the market in any given year, and firm exit, we see quite a steep decline that's really been going on since the last 70 or so years, where firm entry has been on a kind of permanent decline. But there, as you can see, there are patches where it's kind of intensified, and we see it's at a kind of very low point at the moment based on its high points, whereas firm exit is kind of fairly high according to its historical norm. So that tells us the United States economy has become far less entrepreneurial over the last 35-40 years. And here we can see the same thing in terms of the decline of startups, so startup companies, and we see from going back to quite a way, we can see the same sort of trend going on in this graph of sort of startups very much declining. So the idea of entrepreneurial universities and how they're going to sort of play a role in this sort of development of an entrepreneurial society, and this involves the emergence of technology and knowledge transfer as a third mission alongside teaching and research. Teaching and research being the two kind of traditional missions of the university. So the suggestion here is that technology and knowledge transfer will become a third kind of central mission of the university. And this, of course, will involve extensive outreach activities aimed at industry and schools. Universities across the world, of course, often depend on public funding as their main source of income. So one of the issues here is going to be how to compensate the public for funding these initiatives. How much of the gains, how much of the profit is going to remain in private hands from the startups who develop it. But of course, if it's public money that's funding the research, then the public should be compensated, and public universities should be compensated for their promotion of research that ultimately gives rise to profitable ventures. So universities are seen as incubators or intermediaries, and providing a supportive environment for exploring and evaluating ideas. Okay, now let's take a look at Francisco's essay on technology and transnational families. Francisco looks at the effects of advances in technology on the transnational family. And what's very important in her essay are the new possibilities for digital face-to-face interaction in apps like Skype, WhatsApp, and FaceTime, and new apps that are appearing all the time. And instant updates as well allows families to develop new forms of intimacy despite living far away from one another. So it allows the sort of visual contact, the visual register, as Francisco calls it, allows for these new forms of contact to develop between family members who are living in far distances from one another. And again, this may be because they're undocumented and aren't able to return home. It may be because of the situation in their home country doesn't permit them to return home. So for whatever the reason is, these technologies are providing some kind of solution to that family distance. So Francisco claims that types of technology engender particular types of intimacies. So as the technologies develop, different forms of intimacy are enabled by the new possibilities for the interaction, depending on how the technology enables people to interact, whether it's visual and sort of how it works, the kind of things you're permitted access to with other people, with families far away. So let's take a look at some of the changes. So when letter writing was the main source of staying in touch with a family, migrants report that it often left them feeling isolated and detached from their families back home. And if you think about the rhythm of letter writing, that's kind of makes sense, where, you know, it's by the time a letter is received, it's a significant amount of time, maybe up to a week, since the person sort of had those thoughts and experiences, and it takes the same time to respond to a letter you receive. So it doesn't have the immediacy of contact. Obviously, and of course, there are things you can share in a letter and things you can express that perhaps are best expressed by writing, but it tends to be a kind of slow form of contact that doesn't allow you access to kind of day-to-day activities and day-to-day behavior and the kind of, you know, the ordinary setting of home life. The mobile phone, when it arrived, allowed for a new form of connectivity, people reporting that it makes it possible for family members to learn about each other's experiences and sacrifices. So phones increase the frequency and accessibility of contact. On the other hand, of course, they sometimes allow for feelings of surveillance and harassment. And that's often the sort of flip side of these technologies that allow access. Access is good when everybody wants to be seen and everybody wants to be, everybody wants to be sort of part of the family conversation. But there are going to be times when that's not the case, when this kind of access has more of the kind of unwelcome feel of surveillance. So there's ambivalence among families about the type of access that it provides to family life, and we'll see that sort of intensify with the newer technologies. So it's the visual register of webcam software, according to Francisco, that changes the texture of the communication migrants have with their families. And it produces an effect of what she calls integration, presence, and surveillance. So let's have a think about those terms and how they're supposed to work. So the most important thing, I think, presence. Webcam interaction allows for a much greater sense of physical intimacy and closeness. And because of this, it supports what she calls care work. So because family members can stay up to date with each other's progress, they can see each other, they can literally see each other getting bigger and growing and changing and so on, and they can see when they're upset and see when they're happy. And parents and caregivers can feel reassured in promoting growth and development of the children. So in sending money back home, they can sort of see the results of that money. They can see what they've, what's been bought. They can see what they're doing with it, how they're growing, how they're developing. So it provides this sense of physical intimacy that they feel that even though they're a long way away, migrants feel that they're in touch with family members back home, that they can sort of keep a check on each other, that they're close to them, and so it provides this reassurance that they can participate in the growth and development of their children, which otherwise they kind of feel very detached from. A second component that Francisco talks about here is integration. And here it's the fact that the visual component of webcam technology integrates the lives of families separated by distance. And it's the important fact that even banal and ordinary parts of family life become something that can be shared with family members from afar. So, whether it's not something completely banal, but a birthday can be celebrated. The sort of migrant family members can be there, can be present, can share. So it sort of provides this coming together of families, this sense of family unity, this sense of togetherness that without that visual component and without the kind of permanent possibility of being physically and sort of visually in families' lives, it's harder to recreate that sort of moment. So it integrates families. It provides this experience, this sense that families are still together, are still kind of connected, despite being, family members at far distances from one another, and only brought together with the technology. It still creates this sense of integration. And of course, the flip side of these points is the sense of surveillance. Many family members found the constant feeling of being watched to be one that was difficult to deal with. So again, this is the kind of the unwelcome part of surveillance, when you don't want to be seen, you don't want to be watched. So migrant women, as Francisco says, launching surveillance of husbands and households, do so to keep control of the kind of household they would want if they were still back home. So there's a kind of desire to keep a check on what's going on back home, to make sure it's still it's still sort of maintaining the standards and the norms that was sort of part of family life. So that can get a bit frustrating, and that depending on the relations between family members, that can create some stress about being watched, about being seen, when it's not always a comfortable thing. And negotiating those relations of sort of privacy and availability is something that still needs to take place with the technology. Okay, so let's think about a couple of conclusions, a couple of things to take away from this week. So we talked about the shift in technology transfer in the current era from north-south transfers to the idea of competitive advantage, and we saw that universities have been accorded a new role in this process as the promoters of technology and knowledge transfer. And we saw the the idea behind this of creating an entrepreneurial society. And I think some of the problems with that idea as well, the idea of an entrepreneurial society, that it hasn't really thought carefully about how the economy really needs to be structured and maybe restructured to make that happen. And the problem is the current global system has given a small number of global corporations a very significant advantage that makes it hard for new companies and startups to compete. So unless there's some kind of important structural corporate change in the way corporations operate and do business, it's hard to see how this idea of an entrepreneurial society is going to come about. And of course, with universities, we see this new role that's being given to them of technology and knowledge transfer. And one of the things to think about here is how this mission is going to subsist with the university's other missions of research and teaching. Will it conflict with those missions? Will it lead to universities being sucked into a kind of corporate approach and chasing corporate money instead of relying on what should be their main missions of teaching students and researching knowledge regardless of its benefits or usefulness? So there are some conflicts there certainly to negotiate. We also saw how technology is affecting relationships between members of transnational families, making possible new forms of intimacy and bringing families closer together through the new visual registers of the technology that allows this form of intimacy. And some of the problems with that about the sort of the times when people feel that being watched is a form of surveillance and so on. So still obviously difficulties to negotiate here, but certainly the sort of changes in technology and new sort of possibilities for staying in touch even in kind of ordinary and banal situations provides for this new sense of togetherness and integration and this sort of feeling of presence among families that are separated by large distance.